This week, Riyadh is closing the 16th Convention to Combat Desertification, or the Cop16 for UNCCD. It's been hosting it since December 3rd. And there are lots of different COPs. I think people always think about the climate one, but there's also land and I think ocean. But Saudi is hosting the one that's on land, or desertification and droughts, this week, or has been. The event was sponsored by many different Saudi entities. You had STC, Aqua Power, the Saudi Fund for Development, Roshan, Ma'aden, and more. So these entities were sponsoring this event, and Saudi's hosting of it. And what actually that translates into is a lot of money and pledges to combat desertification and drought. So over $12 billion were pledged to support this. And this is an area that tends to be underfunded. The conference really is a convening space for global players in, the world that are interested in combating drought and desertification and ensuring land restoration and soil fertility and so on. So it's a place where the global community is coming together to talk about how we can combat this, what the dangers are. And, again, it is right in line with what Saudi Arabia is doing right now with the Saudi Green Initiative, which is a pledge to plant 10 billion trees in Saudi Arabia. And then the wider Middle East Green Initiative, which is very similar. It's bringing a lot of these different issues to the fore, where we talk about why it's important to create more fertile soil. That, of course, creates microclimates where you get more rainfall, which leads to better groundwater retention and less erratic weather patterns. So I think it's pretty cool that Saudi Arabia is this convening space, and there have been so many events happening in parallel. And actually throughout the event, I think there's a blue zone and a green zone. I may have made those colors up, but there's two zones. One where there's these official delegations really talking about the developments in this space and the research, and then more civil society entities and private sector events where they're really talking about what they are doing in this space for sustainability advancement, and specifically talking about land and soil.
Saudi Arabia is obviously a desert. Like, a lot of it is desert, not all of it, but a lot of it is desert. So it's interesting that this would be the location for the desertification convening conference, because most desertification, which is not an easy word to say, most desertification is happening in Africa and South America and some in Asia as well. Saudi Arabia is already a desert, but it is working to combat desertification and actually reverse desertification, which is also kind of fun to say. And so it's really cool to see Saudi Arabia as the convener location for this. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is doing its reverse desertification in the form of the Saudi Green Initiative, planting 10 billion trees. And that is not just with land. This December also marked the launch of the National Red Sea Sustainability Strategy to promote the blue economy and environmental conservation. It should be conservation.
Yeah,
right?
I agree with you. I think it should be conservation.
Conservatism to me is a political bent.
It's a different thing.
Anyway, so yeah, that could be the UK-US kind of thing.
Possibly,
how like different. Yeah. Anyway, who knows? But just really cool to see them sort of taking the charge here. It does fit into the theme of Saudi Arabia as global events convener, which is definitely a theme of this podcast. We're seeing a lot of it now, especially in Riyadh. So it's good to see. And yeah, and as I mentioned on a previous show, Saudi Arabia is planting tons and tons of Mandalorian trees on the coast. Of course, it is actually mangrove. Yeah, I know, right. But I just can't believe I made that mistake earlier. Too much Star Wars. But just good to see this, and good to see Saudi Arabia leading it. I mean, desertification, a problem that happened in the United States in the 1920s and 30s really badly, to the point where dust clouds were engulfing Washington, D.C. that emerged in the West from over farming and people taking advantage of the Homestead Act, etc. Famous, and we believe we talked about it on a previous show. Ken Burns' documentary, the Dust Bowl, must see, really cool on this subject.
Yeah, I mean, there has been a lot of interesting work done on regenerative farming as well, which really is looking at how you can kind of, I think the idea of it is to find land that has been depleted of its kind of fertility and then thinking of ways to really just kind of revive it in an interesting way. There's a really cool documentary that I saw on El Bela, which is over in Southwest Saudi, so near Mecca, actually, looking at how they were able to utilize kind of traditional forms of farming to bring the desert to life. It's a phenomenal documentary. And actually the architect and I want to say the scientist that was leading this had done it already in China. And so it was a very, very cool project. And I think that this idea that, you know, once it's done, that's it, is something we really need to overcome, because I think there's some, just when you have traditional methods, you can really kind of look at how people understood water patterns when it rained. They understood where you should grow things, where you shouldn't. And all of that really translates into a better management and a better relationship between humans and the environment that they're living in. And that will combat that drought and create more soil resilience, which is so important. So yeah, I think there's a lot going on. You know who else was there other than all of the UN officials that were talking about drought and desertification in Riyadh this week?
Will Smith.
Yeah.
Spike Lee.
Those guys, which is pretty cool. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But also President Macron, the French president, was in Saudi Arabia, right? And he also was talking sustainability with Saudi, wasn't he?
Lots of deals signed this week between French companies, especially I think it's EDF is their sort of energy company, and Saudi partners for Total. I think it's, Total may be the one I'm thinking of, and Saudi partners, especially in the solar space. That was a pretty good visit, right? He went to Al Ula. He seemed to have a good time. Yeah.
And aviation. I think they were looking at green aviation and kind of I think they were looking at ways to produce better fuel for the aviation sector.
Yeah, and then Macron just went right back on his presidential private jet.
Of course he did.
Major super polluter. Who wouldn't do that?
Yeah,
of course, your boy is there in Saudi Arabia right now, right? The new UK PM. Is he not in Saudi Arabia right now?
Is Keir there as we speak?
Keir,
I don't really follow his travel schedule.
You don't get a travel alert for him? Okay, that's cool. I
don't. But yeah, Keir Starmer, I know, was going to go, because I did see something in the headlines talking about like Keir about to go to Saudi. It didn't make headlines the way the Qatari state visit made headlines here. Like they came, right? And like the British press was just eating it up. They're like, look at the beautiful second wife of the Qatari emir coming with him. And Prince William and Kate received them. There was it was a really interesting way that they covered that visit. Anyway, I obviously have gone off on a complete tangent.
We're going off a little bit. We've talked about The Guardian, which I love to hate to love, but they never hold any punches back, do they? It's interesting too. In Saudi Arabia last year, parts of Saudi Arabia got 700% of the historical average of rain in the winter rainy season. And that kind of went viral, right? Because it transformed several areas that were typically barren and dry landscapes into sort of like super bloom flower farms that were everywhere, that were super cool to see. It does seem anecdotally, and this is not a scientific statement, that Saudi Arabia is getting more and more rain these days. You can't say that based on 1 year, but it's just interesting. And yeah, climate change is, giving and taking, as it were. So it's a very important topic, and a very important topic for Saudi Arabia. And I'm sure as you grew up, Hannah, in Saudi Arabia, right? I mean, like, there was already ongoing desertification efforts. There was already awareness of this. Yeah.
There was. It was something that we talked about quite a bit. There was, campaigns against desertification and so on. It was definitely something that's been on the radar for a long time. And when we talked about the environment, a lot of times we talked about either recycling or desertification. But can I just say that one of the things, the misperceptions that I had to combat most of my life had to do with the fact that, I live in a desert, therefore there must never be any rain. It must be super dry. And when I would tell people, actually, it does rain, and when it rains, it's like beautiful thunderstorms, because I kind of really like thunderstorms. I think that lightning is beautiful, and it's one of my favorite things to watch. And we used to have a room, and I think I've mentioned this before, we used to have this room in our house that was all glass, and we'd just sit and watch lightning. So when there were storms, they were big. But what would happen the next day, Okay, you might have some flooding in the streets, which was not good. But the other thing was the desert, which was sandy brown, would turn green. And you would just get this beautiful cover of life, the green life that was just waiting for a little bit of rain to come back to bloom. And it was just always my favorite part after the rain is watching the desert turn green.
It's cool. I love that you had a all glass thunderstorm room growing up. That's pretty cool.
It was really cool, actually.
It's really cool.